Hi, and hearing people's tales of woe from Crucible of Storms with the melee unfriendly nature of one of the fights has prompted me to discuss what I see as the issue with this thing and what is, frankly, at this point, the only solution. So when it comes to melee unfriendly fights over the ages in World of Warcraft, it's essentially come down to a series of things. So what is it that gives melee a tougher time? First of all would be ground mechanics around the boss. Now these ones may be ones that are harder to see under a boss, or it could be ones that are only present under a boss. Sometimes, you know, these ground mechanics means that you have to, for periods of time, completely move away, which means you're not really doing any DPS at all. Another thing could be switching targets. When those two mobs are some distance apart of necessity, you're losing downtime switching from one to the other. You might have a poor view of incoming ads. Yes, there'll be other people in the raid who can inform you of that, but still your field of view on some bosses, not all, is severely impaired. You've got things like tail swipe or similar mechanics as well to watch out for if a boss particularly has to be moved around, as well as having those sorts of mechanics. And you may have extended periods of time needed to deal with mechanics such as puddle dropping. For example, a mechanic happens on you, you have to go somewhere else to dispose of it safely, and you're moving far away from your position, whereas if you were ranged, you could position yourself between the place for dropping the puddles and the boss and not have to move as far and not have to take DPS off for as long, if at all. Now, some melee classes, of course, cope better than others due to, for example, utility that allows them to ignore certain mechanics, or due to more impressive movement options that would allow less downtime, as I said, to deal with those mechanics before you can get DPS back on the boss or ads or whatever it is you are DPSing. But this is not something that is ever going to be solved with Blizzard's current philosophy, because not only is there an emphasis on having very unique classes, which is of course very important. There's no point in having a class if it's not going to be unique compared to the others. But over the last few years, Blizzard have moved more towards not just unique classes, but unique specs. Now, what specs used to be were, if you were a pure DPS class, it was an opportunity to be good at different types of things. So you might have a spec that was particularly suitable for AoE DPS, one that was particularly suitable for single target DPS, maybe another one that was useful for something else like survival or something like that. Not the survival hunter spec, but survivability. And you know, that gave you, and that meant that pure DPS specs were always a bit better than the so-called hybrid classes, the ones that had, you know, maybe tanking and or healing options as well, because they just had more specs available to them that they could switch from fight to fight, particularly when dual spec became a thing and you could switch between them without paying a fortune in gold. But very recently, what Blizzard have done is made each spec like its own class. And in fact, I had some hope last January, before BFA came out, Ian Hazakostas was acknowledging that the class fantasy that they kept pushing in Legion had actually become spec fantasy, and that each spec was like its own class. And actually what they maybe should have done was to make sure that, you know, classes, each individual spec within a class, yes, plays differently, has its different strengths and so on, but you know, the utility should be class wide, not spec wide. And he acknowledged that, and he said, yes, we should absolutely do that, apart from the healing utilities. And then they completely went the other way for BFA, as we've now seen, and now they're openly saying, in fact the words were actually used, it's like we've got 36 classes, because that's what it is now. They've now gone much more into each spec has to be effectively its own class, completely distinct from the others, or almost completely distinct. And that is really it now. The specs, the different specs of some classes don't really feel like the same class in some ways. They are very distinct, which means that you are going to get some winners and losers when it comes to raid boss fights. And the issue is, of course, there are only so many boss mechanics. You know, the way Blizzard do, and they do it really well, and they make bosses seem unique, is because they just put in different combinations of mechanics. There are very few ever new mechanics, genuinely new mechanics. In Legion, there was like one. But what they do is they do it in different ways. Sometimes it's just cosmetically different. Sometimes it's just the combination of different mechanics that makes something seem very, very different as a fight. But you do have the same ones, and the same sort of classes that have a utility to deal with this common problem will always be able to deal with this common problem. And you know that certain classes are always going to be desirable in fights in general without knowing about specific ones. So there's no help while that philosophy is maintained going to come from the class design team. They can't help with that regard. When it comes to the encounter design team, you could say to yourself, well, should we just not put in the mechanics that are going to make it extra tough for people without good reason? That's not going to happen either, because when the raid size, it used to be there was 10 man and 25 man, and they got it to the point where they were saying both of them are going to be a suitable challenge. And then they completely got rid of that and changed it to 20 man for what now became Mythic. Basically saying it was too hard to design encounters for 10 and 25 man and make them both as challenging as each other. So we're going to have one fixed size, and then we're basically going to let our class designers run riot. But because they reduced that size to 20, it was increased from some people's point of view. But what it meant was you then you're giving the encounter designers free reign with boss design, but they're going to put mechanics in that need something to deal with it if your class doesn't have that thing to deal with it. And 20 isn't even enough for 2 of every class. It's enough for about 1.5 of each class. So you are going to again get some classes, particularly DPS classes, losing out in this scenario. And as I say, that is not going to... So we're not going to get any help from the class design team. We're not going to get any help from the encounter design team. Ian Hazakostas did say after the debacle that was the Tomb of Sargeras last expansion that is going to get the class design team and the encounter design team to work together, which should have been an obvious thing from the start. That should always have been happening, but it wasn't. But that also doesn't seem to be happening too well either. And of course, it's also very difficult in the way they approach both those things. Because, sure, you could have the class design team and the encounter design team talking to each other while an expansion is being built up. The problem was, of course, that in this case, the class design team kept having their parameters shifted throughout testing. Blizzard kept throwing different things in, like the changes to GCDs and things like that. They also were changing things like they wanted everyone to have more downtime. Then they eased back on those restrictions. So the goalposts kept shifting for the class design team. So they couldn't really coordinate with anyone, even themselves, really. Which is why some of the classes were in such a mess at the end of it all, because it was all so confused. But even if they could, as soon as BFA comes out, effectively that's it for the class design team. Yes, they'll do little tweaks, but they won't do anything major. Or at least not, they're not going to keep redesigning them throughout the expansion. They just tweak and tune, really. Whereas the encounter design team is still doing their stuff. They're still designing those encounters. They haven't designed all the BFA encounters yet. They're still working on them. They've got a plan, of course, but they're still working on them. So you can't have that level of coordination there. So that doesn't work. You're going to get no help from that. It's a bit like Conan Doyle, isn't it? With Sherlock Holmes saying, once you've eliminated all the reasonable outcomes, I'm not going to do it word for word because I'm going to forget, then whatever remains, no matter how illogical, must be the truth. And it's a bit like this. When you look at all the possible ways to solve this issue, why do we have it that some classes are just not going to be... You're not going to want to bring them on certain fights? Why did we move away from, bring the player, not the class? Why do we have a situation where, a particular... And melee classes as well. I mean, it's doubly annoying because 9 of the 12 classes have melee specs and 6 of them have to be melee. That's it. They have no range spec. And therein lies the only solution that's left. If Blizzard maintain their general philosophy on this, there is only one solution to this problem. And that it is that every class needs a ranged DPS spec. Simple as that. Warriors need a ranged DPS spec. Death Knights need a ranged DPS spec. Paladins need a ranged DPS spec. Rogues, monks, demon hunters, they all need a ranged DPS spec. So that at least you have the option. Now, not every player would necessarily see that as something that would solve the problem for them. Bear in mind, for example, shamans, and I suppose now hunters and druids, but shamans and druids forever have had access to melee and DPS, ranged DPS. Whereas, but you'll get, for example, feral druids who will not go boomkin, and vice versa, and that's fair enough. It's a very different thing, but at least the option was there. The option is there for a feral druid, instead of chuntering on the bench going melee unfriendly tactics, to go, well, I'm going to turn into an owl. I'm going to come along anyway. There is that option. That option needs to be there for the other classes as well. And you think to yourself, oh, but that means creating loads of new specs and loads of new design. And, oh, they're already trying to do 36 completely unique designs. They can't do more. No, they can't. That wouldn't work. We were talking about this in the Azeroth review. We were talking about it last week, but it's something we talked about even months ago. And the idea came about, and it is the only way to do it, as ridiculous as it sounds, is if you need to give all these other classes a DPS spec, a ranged DPS spec, you just need to take one off someone else. And not what you're thinking. Here's a scenario for a paladin, for example. So what if the paladin, as a fourth spec, had Shadow Priest spec? Exactly the same as a Shadow Priest. You change the names of the spells to make it sound more holy and less demonic. And you change the colour of it from like a purpley blackness to more of a yellow, holy, light colour. But otherwise, exactly the same mechanics. Doesn't require any extra development, doesn't require any extra tuning. It's just there. You just lift it from that. And if priests don't like that idea, of course, they can have the retribution spec. And that could be, again, you change the names of things. You whack things over the head with a big stick, your staff. That you can still use your staff. You know, just do that. And it sounds mad, but in actual fact, that is the only way to solve the problem, frankly. Because Blizzard have made it clear they're not going to change their encounter design to make sure that it's roughly on a level playing field with everyone else. And that's actually fair enough, because that would restrict them too much. And they're not going to change their class design philosophy, or shall I say now spec design philosophy. So this is it. That's the only thing. Let me know what you think. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.